it's time for our first online lecture of the year, and the lecture is public opinion. So it's a quick one, and it's pretty straightforward. Let's get started. Make sure that you answer the questions on the Schoology quiz after this. I think I'll give you 2 tries just in case you mess up the first time. All right, so public opinion. Um, Obviously, we're learning a lot about public opinion right now just by the nature of the news and the Republican candidates that are running for president, as well as the Democrats too. So the types of publics that we have, A is the elites. So publics being like different types of people. And we learned before about the elite theory that rich people have more say in this country, and it's probably true. So it's not necessarily money, but it often is. It's those with disproportionate amount of political resources. So in other words, people that have a big impact on things that happen in politics. What do? They help raise and set the national agenda, and they help influence the resolution of issues. So powerful people do have an impact on policy in this country. Powerful people are known as elites. Sorry, I'm getting a text message. Oh, John Hamm won the Emmy for Best Actor in a Drama. Way to go, John Hamm. Okay, sorry. I got distracted. What other types of publics are there? Well, there's the attentive public. You can decide if this applies to you. The attentive public are people with an active interest in government and politics. It definitely applies to me. Someone that is closely following and cares a lot about government and politics and has a lot of interest. And then there's the mass public. This is most of the American people, sadly. It's those people with little interest in government and politics. They don't care that much about what happens, or they don't feel like they have much of an impact on what happens. By the way, look at this. Look at this lovely stapler. Very nice stapler. This might come up in a question on Schoology. Okay. What other, or rather, I guess that's all of our publics, the elites, the attentive, and the mass. And then we all hold different types of opinions. So let's look at the different types of opinions that you might have. So think for a second about your stand on your particular opinion on abortion or the death penalty. It's very unlikely that you're going to change the way you feel about this issue. So we would call that a stable opinion. You have felt this way for a long time. There's probably nobody that can convince you that that you should change your stance on abortion. So it's a stable opinion. Letter B is a fluid opinion. It's one that can change frequently. Perhaps your opinion of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Carly Fiorina. Maybe that can change frequently, so it's your opinion of the candidates right now. I know my opinion too is fluid, and it's changing week by week. Fluid is like water, able to move. There's latent, which means that it's kind of dormant, but it could be aroused. For instance, imagine if Barack Obama decided we're going to go to war into Syria, and we're going to have a military draft where we draft men and women who are 18 years old. Right now you might not care that much about politics, but it's an opinion that could be aroused because suddenly the draft would have a big impact on your life as you're about to graduate high school and go into college. There's the salient opinion. A salient opinion is one that has some importance to some people. So maybe you're passionate about it, but not everybody is passionate about it. For instance, gun control. Maybe it really matters to you, but maybe to other people it doesn't matter so much. There's the consensus type of opinion. This is one that's shared by 75% of the people in our country or more. So these are really obvious types of opinions like, should we have a balanced budget? Or should the president not be able to serve 20 straight terms? Like obvious types of opinions that are held by a consensus of the country. And then there's the polarizing opinions. A polarizing opinion is one that's shared by less than 75% of the country. So maybe gun control, or maybe adding an amendment to the Constitution giving equal rights for women. Or I know there's one in California right now that's kind of controversial. They passed a bill that says employers must pay women and men exactly the same, and they have to provide evidence that they're doing that. And that's kind of a controversial bill in California because of the fact that the employers have to submit evidence and show the salary of all their employees. So that's a polarizing type of opinion, one that's not shared by over 75%. That's quite a few opinions, don't you think? How about like the funding of Planned Parenthood? That's a polarizing opinion. There are people that think we should fund it, and there are people that do not think we should fund it. How do we measure these public opinions? Well, there are different ways to do it. We can have an election. An election is an obvious way to determine public opinion. At least it tells us who's voting and how they feel about it. But elections can be deceiving because they do not tell us why people voted the way that they did. What's another way that we can measure public opinion? There are these things called straw polls. A straw poll is like when I ask you in class to raise your hand. Who feels like we should get rid of the death penalty? And then you raise your hand, and I look around the room, and I just can I can count heads and say, okay, 20 out of 40 people think we should get rid of the death penalty. That's a straw poll, and sometimes they have those at like big conventions where they can decide the way that people feel on opinions. Maybe in Iowa they have these little straw polls. For instance, I think the Republicans get together. I remember Ron Paul would go to these little conventions and they would have straw polls to decide, what candidate you agreed with and what issues you agreed with. Anyway, that's a straw poll. They don't come up too much, but it's basically an informal poll, kind of like a head count. Lastly, and this is the most common one, and I've already posted articles on Schoology and stuff that include these, but scientific polls. Scientific polls are one of the best ways to measure public opinion. Let's look at what a scientific poll is. A scientific poll is trying to measure a certain universe. In this case, a universe means the population that we want to measure. So, for instance, we want to know how the whole country thought about how Carly Fiorina did in the Republican debate. So our universe would be the whole country. Or maybe you want to find out what Iowa thought of how Carly Fiorina did, just Iowa. Then Iowa would be your universe. All right? And the way that you find that out is you figure out your sample, okay? Typically you want to ask around 2,000 people at a minimum in order to get solid results. And you have to do this randomly, through random means, where every person in the universe has an equal chance of being selected. So if you're polling the entire country, then you're calling up people on the phone who live in California, Massachusetts, Florida, Iowa, Arkansas, Wisconsin. You're calling up people all over the place. You're calling up over 2,000 people so that you can have the most accurate results. And if you're calling up people in Iowa, you're calling up randomly. If your universe is just Iowa, you're calling up people randomly throughout the state, but you're calling, maybe you're going to call the big cities more because that's where more people live, and the farmland less because that's where less people live. But it has to be random, and there's a lot of little things you have to take into account, and we'll look at that. When a poll is done, typically it has like an error. You might have seen like, Donald Trump has 25% support. Plus or minus, this poll is plus or minus 4% correct. So him having 25% support might actually mean 21, or it might actually mean 29. But every poll, it has like I think they call it a margin of error. A lot of times they'll say, well, it could be this or it could be that. But it's something like 4 points up or 4 points down, but no more than that. I'm actually not sure how they determine the plus or minus. I think the more people that they ask, the more and more and more accurate a poll becomes. So you can reduce the sampling error by adding more respondents, but at some point you can't ask 1 million Americans and expect to get better results than asking 500,000 Americans. That's what that means. Picture somebody's calling you up on the phone and they're asking you a question, what's your stance on abortion? They're going to be reading off a paper, and they have to read the question the exact same way to everybody that they call, because if they just go off their memory or something, they could start twisting the question. And we want to avoid bias as much as possible. So they're going to read a question off a piece of paper. And then you also have to see letter D down here. You have to select how are you going to poll people. So I keep using the phone call as an example, but you can do an internet poll. You can send people mail at their home. But there are potential problems with the way that you choose to poll your people. Let's look. I'll give you a second to think about this. What's a problem with having a poll that calls voters only between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. on Sundays? All right. You know what? I'm not crazy about that question. I'm going to rephrase it. I'm going to rephrase it to between noon and 5 p.m. on Thursdays. Let's rephrase. Okay, let's look at the new question. What is the problem with having a poll that calls voters only between noon and 5 p.m. on Thursdays? So I'm going to give you a minute to think about that while I just sit here. You can look at my lovely Schnauzer cup. That's my dog, Winston. He got his own cup. I'll let you think about that. What is the problem with having a poll that only calls voters between noon and 5 p.m. on Thursday to ask their opinion? So the problem with this poll would be that you are calling people that are home on Thursdays between noon and 5. So that's, I mean, most people who are working Americans are out of the house. So you're probably going to just call old people, you know, or unemployed people. And so that means that the opinion that you're measuring is probably not an accurate one. Another example is, how are you going to call them? Are you going to call them on their cell phones or just landlines? A lot of polls in the past were just the landlines. And so the problem with that is that, hope this is still recording. The problem with that is, I don't know about you, but I don't even have a landline at my house anymore. So that is not going to be measuring the right people. Probably someone more likely to have a landline is an older person. Here's another one. What's an example of a biased political poll question? So this happens sometimes too. Imagine they call you up and they say, are you in favor of the murder of babies for profit? Of the murder of unborn babies for profit? Is that the same way of wording a question as, are you in favor of Planned Parenthood performing abortions? Those are the same question, but not really the same question, right? And you're much more likely to get a certain result if you ask the question a certain way. Okay, how do we use these polls that we make? Polls are used to inform the public, so they're a way to let us know what other people think. They're a way to inform the candidates running. This is a big one. Not just the ones running, but also office holders too. So people can kind of test the waters and see if something is a popular idea, and they can come out in support of that idea. Polls can be, in a way, they can be kind of a way to manipulate people, and you can take a belief on something that most people feel the same way in order to become more popular. And then on election night, you can figure out if you're going to win or not by using exit polls. An exit poll looks at the people who are leaving the voting stations after voting night. So I go down to the fire station, literally, and I vote at the fire station. And when I leave, there's a guy that asks me if I want to tell him how I voted. He works for like the newspaper or something. And what he's doing is he's taking an exit poll to find out, because we're not going to have an official count until sometimes late into the night or the next day, and so an exit poll gives you an idea really, really quick, basically, so that you don't have to wait for the official results. How big of a role do you think public opinion polls should have on a politician's behavior? Do you think that you elect a politician? I guess it's a matter of why did you elect them? Do you elect a politician in order to have them do what the American people want? Or did you elect a politician in order to have them do what they think in their heart is right? And those are two different things. We'll talk more about it in this unit, but that kind of is related to the answer to this question. Alright, let's see what we have left. Just a few more slides. There are some abuses of polls. For instance, right now, this word comes to mind for me every day when we talk about the elections in class. There is this little bit of a horse race mentality during the campaigns. So a lot of times the candidates, it's like less about substance and more about just like how are they doing and are they winning, and we treat the elections and the primary season that heads up to the elections, we treat that like a horse race, like Trump's in the lead, Trump's in the lead, Carson's catching up, Carson's in second place. Uh-oh, here comes Carly Fiorina on the outside. Carly takes over Carson. Now it's Trump and Carly. And it's just kind of, it can be perceived as a little bit of a negative thing because sometimes we're more interested in who's winning than we are in the substance of the election. Let's see what else. People who are in office sometimes pander to the whims of the public by finding out what they believe and then taking that stance. That can be kind of a negative thing. And when it comes to those exit polls I talked about where the guy asked me how I voted when I left, sometimes those can be a bad thing, especially on the West Coast, because projections might say, oh, Obama's going to win. You know, let's say across the country we can see Obama's going to win the election, and the polls are still open here in California. Maybe a lot of people who are going to vote for Mitt Romney don't even bother to go out. So an exit poll could discourage people from voting, especially here on the West Coast. And we saw that in the 2000 election. We realized the problem with exit polls. We'll talk more about this 2000 election. But maybe that kept people from voting because they projected that Florida had gone a certain way, and it turned out that they were wrong, and people didn't vote because they felt like the election was already decided and it was a big mess. So we started, a lot of the news networks have done a better job now where they don't necessarily reveal the results of their exit polls until late into the nighttime when that state's polls have already closed, which is a good thing. And then just think to yourself, kind of like what I was saying before, how does this horse race mentality affect election coverage? And as a result, I would say it kind of has a negative result. Imagine if they never told you who was leading in the polls, and you just you just had to use your own mental capacity to figure out who you think is in the lead. Would that be a better thing than what we have now? Does the current system almost make it impossible for guys like Rand Paul to win because we know, oh, he's not polling well? And then this one's pretty obvious. All right, we have our last slide here. Give me just a second. Okay, sorry about that. Public awareness and interest in politics. Well, unfortunately, much of the country does not have great knowledge of politics, and surveys show that there is a major lack of political knowledge on the part of the public. For instance, if you ask Americans to identify who their local congressman is, who their senators are, their 2 senators for the state, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, unfortunately, gosh, I wonder what it would be, but a super low amount of people could actually name those things. Think about it, you for a second. Can you name our local congressman? I'll give you a second. He's our guy from the House of Representatives. His name is Ken Calvert. Can you name our 2 senators? Can you name the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? All right, our senators are Dianne Feinstein and I'm trying to remember too. Hold on, I'm gonna look it up. Barbara Boxer. I knew it was Barbara. Barbara Boxer. Uh-oh, you got me. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. And then this is just saying that in the past, sometimes we feel like people there's a debate that's going on and you feel like the whole country's paying attention. But I think I talked before about the Equal Rights Amendment. We tried to amend the Constitution to give women equal rights, but 33% of America had never even heard of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it just goes to show you that a lot of people just aren't paying attention in general. Okay, that concludes these notes. Go ahead and answer the questions on Schoology if you haven't been doing that already in the background. Peace.